Jack had always loved the quiet life. His cabin was far from the nearest town, nestled deep in the mountains where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. He was a writer, but he didn't need much company. The mountains gave him everything he needed: peace, isolation, and inspiration. One evening, after finishing a long day of writing, Jack decided to go out and gather some firewood for the night. The sky was clear, and the sun had already started to set, casting long shadows over the forest. The cool air felt refreshing against his skin, and he took in a deep breath, enjoying the smell of pine trees. He walked slowly, cutting through the tall grass and thick underbrush, his axe resting over his shoulder. As he moved deeper into the forest, Jack noticed something strange in the distance. A faint, glowing light flickered between the trees. At first, he thought it was just the setting sun playing tricks on his eyes, but as he moved closer, the light grew brighter. It wasn't the soft orange glow of the sunset. It was something different, something unnatural. Curious and cautious, Jack followed the light, pushing through thick bushes and low branches. The light led him to a small clearing, where the trees opened up to reveal a rock outcropping. At first, Jack thought it was just another strange reflection of light, but then he saw it, a figure standing near the rocks, partially hidden in the shadows. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, far taller than any person he'd ever seen, with a strange shimmering glow around her body. Her skin was a soft silver, almost metallic in the fading light. Her long hair seemed to shift with the wind, shimmering like it was made of the stars themselves. And her eyes, Jack could hardly believe it. Her eyes glowed bright, like two tiny suns. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The woman's gaze was fixed on him, but she didn't make a sound. There was no fear in her expression. But there was something else, something Jack couldn't place. She looked like she had been expecting him, yet at the same time, she was clearly unsure of what to do next. Jack swallowed hard. His mind raced. Could this be some kind of strange animal or a trick of the light? But the way she stood, the way she seemed so human, made him doubt that idea. He took a cautious step forward, raising his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "Hey," Jack said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien woman blinked. For a moment, she did not move, but then, as if hearing his words for the first time, she took a small step back, clearly startled. Her eyes widened, and Jack noticed her body tense, like she was preparing to run or defend herself. Jack immediately froze, his hand still raised in a calm gesture. He didn't want to scare her, but he could tell she was afraid. There was a long pause as the woman studied him closely, her glowing eyes never leaving his face. Jack lowered his hand slowly, trying to show that he meant no harm. He wasn't sure how she could understand him, but something in her expression made him feel like she did. After a few seconds, she seemed to relax a little, though she still remained several feet away, hidden in the shadows. Jack took a deep breath and tried again. "I'm not going to hurt you," he repeated. His voice was soft but steady, hoping to make her feel safe. "I live here. I'm just a writer. I don't mean any trouble." The woman's expression didn't change, but she seemed to be processing his words. Jack wasn't sure if she understood every word, but he felt she was starting to trust him, even if just a little. Then, without warning, she stepped back further into the shadows, her glowing eyes never leaving him. It was clear she was afraid of something. Jack wasn't sure what. Maybe she was afraid of him, or maybe she was afraid of being seen. For a long time, Jack stood there in the clearing, watching her. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply waited. He had no idea who or what this strange woman was, but he felt drawn to her. He wanted to understand, to help her if he could. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, the woman turned and disappeared into the dense forest, vanishing from sight like a shadow. Jack blinked in surprise. He was left standing alone in the clearing. the strange glowing light now gone, and the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Jack stood there for a long time, not sure if what had just happened was real. But one thing was certain: he had seen something that no one else would believe, and he felt a sense of curiosity stirring in him that he couldn't ignore. The days that followed the strange encounter with the glowing woman in the forest were filled with uncertainty for Jack. He couldn't stop thinking about her, her silver skin, her glowing eyes, and the way she disappeared so quickly into the forest. He had never seen anything like her before, and he was sure no one else had either. It wasn't just that she was from somewhere far away. It was the way she moved, the way she seemed so different from anything Jack had known. But what could he do? She had disappeared into the forest, leaving no trace behind. It wasn't like he could go to the authorities or tell anyone about her. They would never believe him. Besides, he didn't want to share this mystery with anyone else. This felt like something personal, something Jack needed to figure out for himself. For the next few days, Jack tried to go about his usual routine. He wrote, took long walks through the woods, and made sure to chop enough firewood for the cold nights ahead. But his mind kept returning to the strange woman. Was she really an alien? And if she was, what did she want? What had she been doing here, in the mountains, alone? One afternoon, after a long morning of writing, Jack decided to go back to the spot where he had seen her. He needed answers. Even though he wasn't sure what he was looking for, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this than just a random encounter. He grabbed his coat, walked out of the cabin, and headed toward the forest. The trees were still bare from winter, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine. Jack walked through the underbrush, taking careful steps to avoid tripping over roots or rocks. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. As Jack reached the clearing near the rocks where he had first seen the woman, he paused and looked around. There was no sign of her, no trace that she had ever been there. The forest was quiet, except for the rustling of the leaves in the wind. But Jack didn't leave. He knew she had been here, and if he was patient, maybe she would return. He spent the next few hours in the clearing, just sitting and waiting. It wasn't like him to waste time like this, but something told him that this was important. He had to understand what had happened. Why had she been hiding from him? What had she been doing in the forest? Around sunset, just as the sky began to turn orange, Jack thought he saw something move between the trees. It was a figure, tall and glowing faintly in the fading light. Jack's heart raced. Could it be her? He stood up quickly, trying not to make any noise. The figure stepped out of the shadows, and Jack could clearly see her now. She was standing by the rocks, watching him. Her glowing eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The woman looked just as she had before, beautiful, otherworldly, and distant. "Hey," Jack said softly, taking a cautious step forward. "I know you're there. I'm not going to hurt you." The woman didn't respond, but she didn't run away either. She just stood there, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Jack felt a strange connection to her, as if they were linked in some way, but he still didn't understand why she was here or what she wanted. Slowly, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the strange metallic object he had found after their first encounter. It had been hidden in the forest, half buried in the dirt, but now it seemed to pulse with a soft, almost alive energy. He held it up, showing it to the woman. "I found this," Jack said. "Is it yours?" The woman's eyes locked onto the object, and for the first time, she took a small step forward. She seemed hesitant, but something in her posture changed. She reached out a hand, slowly, as if unsure whether it was safe to do so. Jack held the object out to her, and she took it from his hand, her fingers brushing against his briefly. He felt a strange tingle at the contact, as if her touch was electric. She looked at the object closely, her eyes scanning it, and then she pressed a small button on its surface. To Jack's surprise, the object came to life, glowing brightly and projecting a strange, shimmering image into the air. It was a map or at least it looked like a map, showing a distant planet. The planet was covered in blue oceans and vast, green landmasses. Jack stared at it, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. It didn't look like Earth. It looked like a whole different world. The woman glanced at Jack, then back at the projection. She pressed the button again, and the image vanished. Jack was speechless. He had no idea what he had just seen, but he knew one thing for sure. The woman was not from Earth. She was from somewhere far away, a place Jack could never have imagined. And somehow, he was caught up in her story, a story he didn't fully understand yet. "Where are you from?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but the woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned and began to walk away, slowly disappearing into the forest once more. Jack stood there, staring after her. The mystery deepened with every step she took. He didn't know how much more he could uncover, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to give up until he learned the truth. The following days were full of confusion for Jack. He couldn't stop thinking about the glowing woman, the strange object, and the mysterious image of the distant planet. What had he seen? Where had she come from? And most importantly, why was she here, hiding in his mountains? He had tried everything he could think of to find her again. He went back to the clearing near the rocks every day, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but she never returned. It seemed as if she had vanished without a trace. Jack began to wonder if perhaps he had imagined the entire encounter. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had touched the alien object, seen the strange map, and felt her presence. This was real. One evening, Jack sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was cool, and the first stars were starting to appear in the sky. He felt a deep sense of longing. He didn't know what he wanted, but he knew he wanted answers. The mystery of the alien woman gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed his help. That night, after dinner, Jack decided to take one last walk through the forest. He felt a pull, a quiet urge to go back to the place where he had first met her. Maybe she was waiting there, or maybe he was just hoping for a sign. Either way, Jack couldn't ignore the feeling inside him. He grabbed his jacket, pulled on his boots, and headed out. The forest was peaceful at night. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Jack walked along the familiar path, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots the only sound in the stillness. As he neared the clearing, his heart began to race. He didn't know why, but he had a sense that something was about to happen. When Jack reached the clearing, he stopped. There, standing just beyond the rocks, was the woman. She was exactly as he remembered her. Tall, silver-skinned, with glowing eyes. She was watching him from the shadows, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jack stood still, trying to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. He wanted to ask her so many questions, but he didn't know how. The silence between them stretched on, and Jack began to wonder if she would run again, like the last time. But this time she didn't. Instead, she took a step forward. Slowly, cautiously, she approached Jack. Her movements were graceful, almost like she was gliding over the ground. Jack didn't know what to do, but he felt an overwhelming urge to remain calm. He didn't want to scare her again. He held his breath and waited. When she was close enough, she stopped and looked at him. Her glowing eyes seemed to pierce through him, as if she was trying to read his thoughts. Jack swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "I won't hurt you," Jack said softly, his voice shaking slightly. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was to reassure her, or maybe it was just the only thing he could think to say. The woman didn't respond, but she didn't seem scared either. Instead, she reached up and touched her chest with her slender fingers. Jack watched her carefully, unsure of what she was doing. Then she slowly placed her hand on her forehead and closed her eyes. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, her silver skin glowing softly in the moonlight. Jack felt a strange connection, something he couldn't explain. It was like they were communicating, not with words, but with a feeling, an understanding that passed between them. He could sense that she was calm, but there was also something deeper, something that made him feel like he wasn't just standing in front of her, but somehow connected to her, as if their thoughts were in sync. He didn't know how to describe it, but it was as if they shared a moment of peace, a silent understanding that didn't need words. After a long pause, the woman opened her eyes and looked at him again. This time, her gaze was softer, less distant. Jack could see the quiet sadness in her eyes, the same sadness he had seen when she first hid from him. She had been afraid of what he wasn't sure. Jack took a slow step forward, his hand outstretched. He didn't know why, but he wanted to help her, to make her feel safe. "I don't understand," he said softly, "but I want to help, if I can." The woman looked at his hand for a moment, then back at him. She hesitated, and for a second, Jack thought she might pull away. But instead, she took a small step closer. Her fingers brushed against his, just lightly enough for him to feel the warmth of her skin. It was the first time she had touched him, and it sent a rush of emotions through Jack. Fear, curiosity, and something else. A deep sense of connection that he couldn't explain. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but when she pulled away, Jack felt that something had changed. She looked at him, and this time there was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet acceptance. "I don't know what you're running from," Jack said, his voice steady now. "But if you need help, I'll do whatever I can." The woman didn't speak, but Jack didn't need her to. He understood, somehow, that she was not ready to share everything yet. But he also understood that this silent moment between them had opened something new, an unspoken bond that neither of them could ignore. As the night deepened, Jack knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. There was so much more to discover, and somehow he was part of the journey now. The next few days were filled with silence between Jack and the woman. She no longer disappeared into the forest when he appeared. Instead, she stayed in the shadows, watching him from a distance. Jack had returned to his normal routine, but his mind was always focused on her. He had so many questions, but he could tell she wasn't ready to answer them. Yet every time they met, there was a silent understanding between them, as if they were both waiting for something to happen. Jack didn't know what it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to unfold. He could feel that she was close, just out of sight, always watching. One evening, after a long day of writing, Jack walked into the forest again. This time, he wasn't just walking out of curiosity. He felt a pull, a sense that tonight was different. Tonight, something would change. The forest was quiet, the air filled with the earthy smell of the trees and the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. Jack moved carefully, his boots crunching softly on the ground. As he neared the clearing, he saw a faint glow in the distance, like a soft light filtering through the trees. When Jack stepped into the clearing, he found her there, waiting. The woman stood near the rocks, her silver skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her eyes met his, and this time, there was no hesitation. She was calm, her expression open but still mysterious. "You came back," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with wonder. He wasn't sure why she had been avoiding him for so long, but it felt like something had shifted. Maybe she was ready to share more with him now. The woman nodded once, but said nothing. She simply looked at him, her gaze deep and knowing. Jack stepped closer, still cautious but filled with a sense of urgency. "I want to understand," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I need to know what's going on. Why are you here? Where did you come from?" For the first time, the woman moved. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, glowing object. It looked similar to the one Jack had found before, but this one was different, sleeker, more refined. She held it out to him, and Jack took it carefully, unsure of what it was. The object in his hands felt warm, almost alive. He stared at it, waiting for her to explain. After a long moment, the woman finally spoke. Her voice was soft, melodic, like the wind rustling through the trees. "I am from a distant world," she said, her words slow and measured. "I was sent here to find something." Jack's heart raced. A distant world. This was more than he had ever imagined. Find something. What? The woman didn't answer immediately. She glanced around the clearing, as if making sure they were alone, then looked back at Jack. Her expression softened. "I've been running for a long time," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can trust you yet, but I need your help." Jack felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. He had always been the kind of person who helped when he could, but this was different. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he felt a deep sense of responsibility toward her. She was alone, lost, and in need of something he didn't yet understand. "What do you need?" Jack asked, his voice sincere. The woman hesitated. "There is something here on Earth, something that was left behind by my people," she said. "I need to find it before others do. It's dangerous, and if it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. This was more serious than he had imagined, but there was no turning back now. The moment they had shared, the way he had felt that strange connection to her, made him want to help, no matter what. "I'll help you," Jack said without thinking. "Whatever it is, we'll find it. Together." The woman nodded, her glowing eyes softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer to Jack, her figure almost ethereal in the moonlight. "I don't know what will happen next, but I promise I'll protect you." Jack could sense the weight of her words. She wasn't just saying them out of politeness. She meant it. And he could tell that whatever they were about to face, it would be bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The alien woman stepped back, and for the first time, Jack saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Hope. It was faint, but it was there. "We need to move quickly," she said. "The others will be looking for me, and they'll stop at nothing to find the artifact." Jack didn't ask what the others were. It didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. He was in this now, whether he understood everything or not. Together, they stood in the clearing, the quiet night surrounding them. Jack didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a chance encounter in the woods. This was a beginning. The beginning of something much bigger, and Jack was ready to face it. The night air grew colder as Jack and the woman stood in the clearing, their faces lit by the soft glow of the moon. A sense of urgency filled the air between them. Jack's mind raced. The woman had just shared something terrifying. The artifact she was searching for was far more dangerous than either of them could imagine, and there were others looking for it too. Others who would stop at nothing to find it. Jack didn't know how to feel. He was in deep now. What had started as a strange encounter in the woods had quickly escalated into something much bigger, something that could change everything. But there was no turning back. He had already made the decision to help her. She needed him. The woman, whose name, Jack realized, he still didn't know, motioned for him to follow her. She turned and started walking, her silver skin glowing faintly in the dark forest. Jack quickly caught up to her. "Where are we going?" he asked. "To find the artifact," she replied. Her voice was steady, but Jack could sense the tension behind her calm exterior. She was more than just worried. She was afraid. And Jack knew that this fear wasn't for herself. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the soft crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor and the distant rustle of the trees. Jack's mind kept racing, trying to make sense of everything. The artifact, the others who were after it, the strange bond that seemed to be forming between him and the alien woman. None of it made sense, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something much bigger was unfolding. Finally, the woman spoke again. "The artifact is hidden," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's buried in a place that's hard to reach. Only a few people know where it is, and I'm one of them. But I'm not the only one who's trying to find it. Who else is after it?" Jack asked. The woman's face darkened. My people, the ones who sent me here, they'd been searching for it for years. But there are others too. Some of them are dangerous. They want the artifact for power. If they get it, they'll use it to destroy entire civilizations. Jack's stomach tightened at the thought. So it's really that dangerous? He asked. Yes, she replied simply. That's why I have to find it first. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest thickening as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The farther they went, the more Jack felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What had started as a curiosity about the strange woman had grown into a mission of survival. There were forces at play here that Jack couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, he was already a part of it. There was no going back now. Eventually, the woman stopped. They had reached a clearing. But this one felt different. The trees were arranged in a perfect circle, and at the center, there was a large stone. It looked ancient, covered in moss and vines, but it radiated a strange energy, something that Jack couldn't explain. This is it, the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. She moved toward the stone, her steps light and careful. The artifact is hidden beneath. Jack watched as she knelt in front of the stone, placing her hands on its surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the stone began to shift. Slowly, it started to move, sliding aside to reveal a small opening beneath it. Jack's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. The woman reached into the opening and pulled out a small, metallic box. It was simple, nothing like the glowing, advanced technology Jack had seen her use before. But there was something about it, something that made his heart race. He could feel the power it held, even from a distance. This is it, the woman said, holding the box out to Jack. This is the artifact. Jack stepped forward, his hands trembling as he took the box. The metal was cool to the touch, and as soon as he held it, he felt a strange pull, as if the box was alive. It seemed to hum softly in his hands, and Jack could feel the energy inside it, growing stronger with every second. Before he could speak, a sound broke through the quiet of the forest. A rustling, followed by footsteps. The woman's eyes darted toward the noise, and Jack felt a rush of fear. They weren't alone. We have to go, she said urgently, grabbing Jack's arm and pulling him toward the trees. Jack didn't hesitate. He didn't need to be told twice. They started running, weaving through the thick forest, the sound of footsteps behind them growing louder. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they ran. He didn't know who was following them, but he knew one thing for sure. Whoever they were not going to stop until they had the artifact. As they ran deeper into the forest, Jack's mind raced. He couldn't believe what was happening. The artifact was in his hands now, and their enemies were close. He glanced at the woman beside him. Her face was set with determination, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes. She had been running for years, and now, with the artifact in their possession, the real danger had only just begun. Jack and the woman sprinted through the forest, their breaths sharp in the cool night air. The sounds of footsteps behind them were growing louder with every passing second. They didn't dare look back. They could hear the branches snapping, the leaves crunching underfoot. Their pursuers were close, too close. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as he ran beside the woman. He glanced at her and saw the focused look on her face. Despite the fear in her eyes, she moved with a grace that Jack couldn't explain. It was as if she knew the forest better than he did, like she was part of it. He followed her lead, weaving around trees and jumping over rocks, trying to keep up. This way, the woman said urgently, veering off the path. Jack didn't hesitate, trusting her completely now. She had been right about everything so far. She knew what she was doing. They needed to get away. The artifact, what it was, and why it was so dangerous, still seemed unclear to Jack, but he understood one thing. They couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. The chase lasted for what felt like hours. The forest seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in around them as they ran. Jack's legs were aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't dare slow down. The sound of their pursuers was growing louder still. Whoever they were relentless. "We're almost there," the woman said, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He could feel the sweat on his forehead, the weight of the metallic box pressing against his chest. It was as if it were alive, pulling him toward something, urging him forward. Suddenly, the woman stopped. Jack nearly ran into her. He looked up to find her staring at a large rock formation in front of them. It was strange. Something about it didn't seem natural, almost like it had been placed there intentionally. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jack looked around, trying to make sense of the situation. "What is it?" "It's a hideout," she explained quickly. "My people built this place long ago. It's safe for now." Without another word, she grabbed Jack's arm and pulled him toward the rock formation. The stone was cold to the touch, but as they approached, a faint glowing symbol appeared on its surface. The woman pressed her palm against the symbol, and Jack watched in awe as the stone began to shift. Slowly, it opened like a door, revealing a dark passageway inside. "Go," she said, pushing Jack inside. "I'll keep them distracted." Jack hesitated for only a moment. "No, I can't leave you." The woman's eyes locked with his, her expression intense. "You have to. It's the only way." Jack wanted to argue, to stay and fight, but he knew she was right. There was no time. The danger was too close, and if they were caught now, it could all be over. With a final glance, Jack stepped into the dark passage. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the walls rough and uneven. Jack's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. He could hear the faint sounds of the woman's voice echoing outside, but there was nothing else, just the silence of the hidden cave. He moved deeper into the tunnel, his mind racing. What was going to happen next? What did the woman mean by "my people"? And who were they running from? He had so many questions, but now wasn't the time for answers. They needed to find safety first. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a noise from deeper within the cave. He froze, straining to hear. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Someone else was here. His heart raced again, but before he could react, a figure appeared in the shadows. Jack stumbled back, but then he saw who it was. The woman, safe for now, her silver skin glowing faintly in the darkness. "You're okay?" Jack asked, his voice filled with relief. She nodded. "For now. But we can't stay here long. They'll find us soon." Jack was about to ask what to do next, but before he could speak, a loud noise echoed through the cave. An explosion. The ground beneath them trembled, and dust fell from the ceiling. "They're getting closer," the woman said, her voice grim. "We have to move." Jack's mind spun. How could they escape? The artifact was still in his hands, its weight heavy with the knowledge that it held the key to something huge, something that could change the future of both their worlds. But now was not the time to think about that. They needed to survive. They needed a plan. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, his voice tense. The woman turned toward a narrow passage ahead. "This way. It leads to another exit. It's our only chance." Without hesitation, Jack followed her, the feeling of the artifact pressing against him with every step. His thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear. They had to escape. The enemy was closing in, and the chase wasn't over yet. As they ran through the dark tunnel, Jack could feel the weight of what was at stake. They weren't just running from pursuers. They were running from a future that could be destroyed, and the only hope they had was the small, mysterious artifact in his hands. The chase had only just begun. The tunnel stretched out before them, dark and narrow. Jack could feel the cool stone walls closing in around him as they moved deeper into the cave. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence, but Jack's mind was too focused on what lay ahead to pay much attention to it. His heart still raced from the chase, and the weight of the artifact in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each step. The woman led the way, her movements swift and purposeful. Jack followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the shadows. The sound of their pursuers was growing fainter now, but Jack knew they couldn't stop. They needed to move faster. They needed to get out of the cave before it was too late. "Are we almost there?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His throat was dry from the running, and his legs ached, but he refused to slow down. "Not now." "We're close," the woman replied without looking back. "But we can't stay in this tunnel for long. They'll find the entrance soon." Jack nodded, but his thoughts were a blur. Who exactly were these people chasing them? The woman had never given him a clear answer, but he had the feeling they weren't just ordinary humans. There was something otherworldly about them, something dangerous. And now, with the artifact in his hands, they were even more of a target. "Where are we going?" Jack asked, trying to focus. "Do you have a plan?" The woman stopped for a moment, glancing over her shoulder at him. Her face was tense, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. "There's a place at the end of the tunnel. It's a safe house. My people used it as a refuge, a place to hide from the ones who would destroy everything." Jack's curiosity grew. "Your people? Who are they?" The woman paused again, her eyes softening slightly. "I've told you before, Jack. I'm not from this world. My people are different. We come from a distant planet, a place far from Earth." Jack felt a strange mix of awe and fear. She had told him little about her past, but it was becoming clearer that her world, and the danger she faced, was far more complicated than he had imagined. "There are others like me, but they are not all good," she continued. "Some of them will do anything to control the power of the artifact." Jack's stomach tightened. What's so special about it? Why does everyone want it? The woman took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. "The artifact holds the key to something much bigger than any of us. It has the power to change the course of entire civilizations. Whoever controls it can shape the future of worlds." Jack stopped walking. The weight of her words sank in. "And if the wrong people get their hands on it, they'll use it to destroy everything." The woman nodded gravely. "Yes, that's why I've been running. That's why I had to find it before anyone else." Jack glanced down at the artifact in his hands. It was small and unassuming, but now he understood its importance. He had always thought of it as just a strange object, something that had somehow come into his possession. But now he knew it was more than that. Much more. "We can't let that happen," Jack said firmly. The woman looked at him, her expression softening for a moment. "I know. That's why I need you, Jack. You're the only one who can help me keep it safe." Jack felt a surge of determination. He didn't know everything, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't back down now. The stakes were too high. He had already made the choice to stand by her, and he wasn't about to stop. They continued moving down the tunnel, the air growing colder with each step. After a few more minutes, they reached the end. The woman stopped in front of a large stone door, covered in glowing symbols. She placed her hand against the door, and the symbols flickered to life, illuminating the tunnel with an eerie light. "This is it," she said, turning to Jack. "Inside, we'll be safe, at least for now." The door slowly opened, revealing a dimly lit chamber. It was small, but there were signs of it having been used in the past. Old blankets, food supplies, and strange devices Jack didn't recognize. The woman stepped inside, but Jack hesitated. He glanced back toward the tunnel, where he could still hear faint sounds of footsteps. "We don't have much time," the woman said, her voice urgent. "We need to make a decision. Do we stay here, or do we move again?" Jack turned to face her. His mind was racing, but his decision was clear. "We can't keep running forever. If we stay here, they'll find us. We need to face this head-on." The woman nodded slowly. "I agree, but it won't be easy. The ones after us are relentless. They won't stop until they have the artifact. Jack stood tall, holding the artifact tightly in his hands. Then we fight. Together. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with something new. Trust. Yes, together. They both knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but they also knew one thing. They couldn't give up. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. With a final glance toward the tunnel entrance, Jack and the woman stepped into the chamber, ready to face whatever came next.